Muy bien, bienvenidos a todos.
Welcome, everyone, in the framework of On the Road to Connectathon 2024. Today, we have the third session of this webinar cycles. Today, we will have Fernando Portilla with us again, and digital health expert and founding member of Raxel, who will be talking today about the IPS standard LAC. And Fernando, please go ahead, take the floor. Thank you, Carlos. Good afternoon to everyone. And as Carlos said, you're all welcome. And today, we will go through the IPS-LAC standard within the context. And this is the standard that within the public good is referenced in order to be used within the Connectathon. So the purpose of the webinar is to understand what are the contents of the IPS, what is the specification for the LACPASS project, and then take a look at a few tools and so that we can get to see throughout the webinar and that have been developed. The technical team has developed certain tools, and in the other half, we will be more practical in the identification of this standard. The idea is to understand what are its contents and then do like a zoom on this specification. One is the logic part, but it's also important to look at this as how it is structured within the FHIR resource and how it is validated and how it is visualized, and all of this with the specification of some codes, the QR codes, and others. So just as a part of having this as a reference, but it's important to mention the IPS profile. And this is a result of a consensus between different experiences because IPS does not happen overnight, right? These came from other projects that advanced in terms of the standards and the cross-border standards, especially in Europe, like the EPSIS project, also some guidelines from the European Union, the digital network, and also in the US. Also, we were mentioning the standards of the country driven by Obamacare and the meaningful use, CCR, CCDA. So all of that at one point, they said we have the standards and we have minimum standards by country, and it was okay, but then maybe there should be a continuity process in patients that travel for various reasons and due to different realities. Some people travel for business, some other for studies, and there's also a migrant phenomenon, or it also happens with tourism. And sometimes go due to health issues. They go for a surgery to a certain country and then they come back. Always, so there is mobility in the patient, and that is called the existential continuity. and to be able to see if what previous information a patient had with a service health provider in order to have their health continuous monitoring and servicing. So that is just like a context. And so the IPS is a standard that has evolved. And behind it, there are many organizations involved, like the ISO, SNOMED, with semantic or nomenclature issues, and now the WHO has been observing this very closely to see what elements could be useful for the cross-border interoperability. And so it's interesting to go through this. First, have a logic view, and then at the end, to try to interact with some of these within the community. As a summary, in terms of the IPS profile, it's a specification that is not complete, but this is at least the minimum that would be recommended to know about a patient that might have had an existential event in a country that is not his native country. So from the left to the right, what kind of information we have, and we will take a look at the exceptions also later on. So the first part talks about the context of this is associated to a document. The IPS is a document that summarizes the patient's history. And so the first part is the context, basically the person, the author, the author of the document, who validates and who is the custodian of the document. Then on the red column, that's required information. And that would be what is the medication that the patient is receiving, what kind of allergies or intolerances, and what kind of problems he's had. Because the logic behind this is, and why it is required, and it is in red. That would be the minimum information that a document should have. But if we have that information, maybe a doctor that doesn't know the patient, at least that would prevent maybe a malpractice or a medical mistake. Because, for example, it would state what kind of medication the patient is taking, maybe something for the blood circulation, or maybe to improve the clotting of the blood, or maybe if or maybe he's allergic to penicillin, and what kind of problems, maybe he's diabetic or with high blood pressure. So maybe so there's risk for allergy, medication he's taking, what kind of diagnosis he's had, and maybe that would be like a snapshot. And for continuity, that has great value. The other ones are other stages that are recommended. We will check each one of these and trying to identify also what kind of resources like HLA7 Fire has. So this is part of the information that is needed. Uh, this brown part is the basic information, but there are specific resource that are the electronic documents and the metadata that we will check in the standard. there we'll see what are the elements associated to each one of the standard elements. However, what the standard identifies here in the header is who's the patient, who's the author of the document, who validates the document, and the repository where the document is stored. Now we will go through the implementation guide for the region, and we can check therefore each one of the elements. So, medications. This is the part of the IPS. So it tells you how the patient is being medicated. Basically, just to say that these are the resources for each section, because medication is not only, for example, if medication is being prescribed currently to a patient and if it is dispensed to that patient. Like in a data model, it could have different types of resources and fire. But that doesn't mean that a section is equal to a resource. Some medication or some of those resources could be the ones at the right. Like then we have, for example, allergy intolerance, anaphylactic, or maybe allergies to medications or food. So there's a basic model to model the allergies, which is allergy intolerance. And we will check the fields in greater detail. Then we have the problems and diagnosis and conditions that are associated to the conditions. And the condition is part of these required sections, and that you can say they are kind of mandatory, but this is required in the standard, but each jurisdiction, according to their governance level, could maybe specify that these sections can be optional. But at least within the international part, this would be required and minimum mandatory information that we should need to know about the client in terms of cross-border attention. Then comes the recommended areas that are recommended but not mandatory, like the immunizations. That's an important part because that's the patient's vaccination history, and that's known as immunization. Then we have the history of procedures, what type of procedures, diagnosis, for example, a heart a catheter or therapeutic, for example, dialysis, different procedures that will also require in that section some use of the resources, and the resource is procedure that models what kind of procedure, but also with what organization and what kind of device, medical device is being used and what people were there. That's why it's called organization and device. When we talk about medical devices, like for example, a pacemaker and other types of devices have been used in a patient or that the patient has, like the pacemaker. And it's important to know that that the patient had or has. And at the right-hand side, we have some of the resources that would model that condition. the diagnostic results. For example, where do I put the laboratories and the images or the reports? That sometimes a report, if I have a colonoscopy or a report on a biopsy test. So we have the PDF document. That can also, the section can be used then to have more granularity and have these test results, or like a blood test and all of the parameters of the blood test, like the plates and the blood count and all of the analysis of a lab test. Or it could also be information that is more specific for monitoring, especially lab results or image results for diagnosis. That could be individualized or be a report, or you could also have access to a DICOM image. That would be the kind of content that you would find there. Then some other optional sections of the IPS that would be recommendable to have are, in terms of criticality, are the vital signs. It's good to have it, but obviously it varies according to the type. But probably what's important to know how they are today and see how maybe they had varied in the past in terms of the past. But these are related to a blood pressure, temperature, breathing frequency, respiratory frequency, like height and weight, body mass index, etc. At the right, it says vital signs, but that's basically a profile that comes from the profile of observation. Observation is one of the more versatile resources in terms of the person, and I recommend that you study it and that you check it out. And more so, if you see here observation, observation is a resource that you can use in different sections of the IPS. Observation can be for the laboratory, but vital signs, or actually there's no resource called vital signs. It's basically just a profile for the observation resource. Also, prior disease history contains a description of the conditions that the patient had in the past. Also, information on pregnancy, status of the pregnancy, probable birth date, but the same resource can be used in different sections, like the social history, like consumption of tobacco or alcohol. There, it's also a part of the observation resource. And the final ones are optional. It's the functional state description of the patient's capacity to carry out everyday activities that must be continuously evaluated by third parties. There's a resource called Care Plan for that. That's also related to the profile of a specific resource. And then we have a care plan and advanced guidelines, which is the narrative description of the anticipated willingness of the patient. So basically, this is an information model. So we have gone through an information model that represents the content and context. Others are required, some others are optional, others are recommended, or optional, so they should be taken into account for the attendance of a patient that is attended for the first time, or that maybe that where his medical history has not been available. So that's the logical model. This is the standard as is, the IPS on fire. And this is why we have this snapshot. And what is the IPS composition? And we'll, after this model, conceptual model of information, we should understand, or at least try to identify the major components of the IPS on fire. So last week we said that fire has different bundles, and basically in fire, when in fire you do operations or transactions, you can send information and resource by resource, like vital signs data or information on the patient or procedures. But in terms of the operation or digital actions, the recommendation of the standard is to use these resource bundles, and this is called the bundle. There are different types of bundles. The most used, and it's basically like, for example, the bundle document, but there are other bundles called transaction bundles. But the bundle document is basically the structuring of a composition and its associated resources. What we see there is that the bundle document is associated to a composition, and because within the composition we mention some resources, these are also within the bundle document, but with a specific syntaxis. So you could link this, like for example, in the upper part, a reference and the subject is the person, for example. It should be referenced in the part below. The author then should also be in a part or the condition. All of these are resources that are included within composition and that the bundle document requires them at the entry level so that the information is consistent in accordance with a document. The upper part you can see is structured, and the lower part, it's each one of them, so it has the necessary consistency. So that is a general snapshot. We will try to go through the implementation guide. There's many ways of getting there. There's just the URL at the left, and at the right we have a QR code where you can go through the main profiles of the IPS-LAC. So we have taken the international IPS and we have localized it to do a specification that is more taken into our region. It's made more local. That's why it's called IPS-LAC. So the IPS emits a guide, and it's the one that we are using. And now we're going to get to the Connectathon. processes. So we're going to get in the IPS-LAC and the implementation guide. I hope all of you have this. Otherwise, I can copy this here in the chat. So that's, I wrote it, sent it via the chat. Basically, to tell you that this is key for all of the processes. If you ask me, where is the guide? Well, that is where we will find the specification or the profiles. And basically, there are definitions that we do for the construction for constructing the bundles. So with this, here it's good to get into the artifacts, and we will basically see two. We will see the LAC bundle and the LAC composition. As I said before, the LAC bundle is the vast bundle, what comprises the composition and the related resources. And the composition is what defines the structure of the document as such. So we will go like from the inside to the outside. Let's see what LAC composition has. Basically, this is a localization, what the international IPS defines. Like here, we have a resource that if you want to do a comparison directly with the model that we saw initially, these are the large fields that we saw with the information of the context. So that information of the context has these variables to see what kind of document it is. Who is the patient? Remember that was at the left-hand side with the subject. Who's validates? Who's the attester? Who's the custodian? And the first fields of a composition emulate, for those of you, for example, who are enabled, well, this is similar. And also similar to a CDA. And what composition has is sections. In sections, we were talking about medication, allergies, etc. So here is where we begin to see the sections, for example, medications. The section for allergies, the section for problems, for procedures, immunizations, medical devices, results, vital signs, and previous diseases, functional status, plan of care, social history, pregnancy history, and advanced directives. So at the modeling level in the composition resource, the first elements are these, which is the context, and he has the possibility to identify different sections. And these sections refer to what we mentioned before that is contained in the model. Now, each of these elements, for example, subject, then medications, allergies, each one of the problems in order to have a consistency with the standard and to guide the document or the specification of the document with the related content. For that, we need a bundle that where I can say, I can send, for example, a composition with so many entries as necessary to represent a bundle or package that has the model of the composition plus the content of the associated resources. For example, it says you send the composition that we saw there, the composition resource, but in addition, we should send the patient entry that refers to the patient that is in the context from the composition elements. And the other one, or many of them, are optional because they might or might not have that information inside within the document. But a composition will have the patient, and you could go to allergies, which is basically the content that is referenced inside the composition, and that is a document bundle. So in that bundle, I say we go to composition, and this is related with the resources that are referenced inside it, not only aiming at a direction, but inside this, we put this information. So the subject and some patient information is mandatory, but the other ones are optional. So this is at the model level. We saw the logic part and how it is represented in the guide, and we will see an example, and we will see how an example would look like.
Entonces vamos a tratar de ir a este.
So now we will go to this line. That's a GitHub from the project, and we will see this at a high level. That's the code. I will try to look at this in a more expanded visor, but that's from a bundle document with a composition and the related resources.
A ver si no, no puedo ver allá. Entonces vamos a verlo directamente sobre el GitHub.
We'll just see it directly
Un editor, lo
with
quería
an
mostrar
editor.
de pronto un editor como
Maybe we could see this as an editor like Bishop that is more versatile. But this is an example that we will see now and try to go through it to understand some of the parts. This is one of the examples that we use within the training tasks and the checkpoints. And this is what we should finally generate. That's why many of you already did an initial tutorial, but for some of you it might be new because you might have new teams. The previous part, which is the implementation guide, this specifies it, and this is an example of what we can find as of this guide. But for Connectathon, we need to generate a bundle document that has the composition and its associated resources. Basically, generate a valid IPS. There's an example of this here where we have a document type bundle, but you could also have a transaction bundle. But as a bundle document, the specifications are different. The first is the composition that has a reference to resources with identifiers. Here is the author, and it also mentions the context of the document. And it basically ends with this custodian. And here it talks about the different exceptions, problem exceptions, and there you have the references with a URN. The content, what it's doing here is doing a reference to the resource identifier. So through the subject or the person, etc., and the composition and declares what kind of content it will have. Each one of the sections, vaccinations, immunizations, and here when the composition ends, a detailed specification begins where we can see the specific information on the patient, aligning this number, this URN, with the identifier that was included previously in each one of the references. For example, the subject has the specific URN, and the identifier of that patient is named here, and then there's consistency where it makes reference to this patient. And the lower part in the composition includes each of the contents. There you have patient information, immunization information, how the profile was done, for example, of the immunization information and diagnosis. Also at the medication level, and I said it could be the medication alone or the medication on this side, which is in the same section, and the allergy part. That would be one example of an IPS. Also, we need to learn how to check. It would be good to start using the access to Gazelle. So we're going to go to Gazelle now. We have an instance through work that is done through IHE in terms of the validations in the validation processes. We saw the guide, we saw the example, and now we will see how to validate. Now that you have the example. So I generated this IPS And then how can I verify that it is correct and that is in accordance with the standard? So in the validator, there's a tool called EVS client. This tool, EVS client, allows to validate under IPS-LAC that we have done to see if it is consistent. So if we go to EVS client, go to home and you get in, and here there's an option to validate fire. It says fire and validate. So for those of you who have downloaded the document JSON that we saw just now, basically you can copy all of JSON here, the IPS-LAC, or you can add it as an example. We will check here where we have it, our IPS-LAC. Here it is. So JSON, we uploaded. Upload. And you select against which validation scheme it should be validated. So we choose, if we do it with the IPS patient summary, we'll have errors. But with this bundle LACPASS, we want to see if the IPS is valid. So we validate it. And this is a document that was prepared previously, and there it says that the IPS is valid. When it's in green, it means it's correct. And if there are problems from the JSON or maybe the keys, staples, and that it is consistent according to the implementation guide. We're saying that within a bundle, we should have a patient and composition, which are required. And maybe they aren't within the composition elements, or if it is in the composition, it might not be within the elements of the bundle of the entire content, that where you have errors, and that's where you begin validating. But this is a valid IPS, and that would be the first task that we should start working on with the information systems. Remember that the guides have a structured definition, and that supports the developments, and to know what kind of JSON it generates. That would be part one. And what we will also see now is that once we validate this, this is the EVS client. When it's relatively simple, remember when we get to the EVS client, we go to fire, then validate, and then we should upload the documents. We could cut and paste the code here, but the JSON code could be too long. So, but you need to choose the type of validator, which is called LACPASS Patient Summary. That it has been done with the implementation guide structure definitions so that we can have that validation scheme. And now getting to the end of my presentation, we have a visor, a viewer in order to visualize an IPS-LAC. And this is very interesting. And those who use libraries are also using this in the world of developers. This is very simple but practical. So we would like to see what's in that JSON and how we can view it. This is the IPS viewer page. I will also share this with you so we can see with the same example that we previously saw. We can check this with the IPS viewer. Something that's very simple. That is, for example, this one doesn't have the upload file. You need to copy all of the data, all of the previous JSON. We should paste it there. So we need to copy all of the JSON content. All of the JSON content in this part. And we will try to press here, view IPS. So this is a viewer. It's very simple where you see the context, the patient, our colleague Sergio Peñafiel, the birth date, what kind of allergies, the diagnosis, medications he has, the dosage. This is very simple, but it's just a viewer. It's a JSON viewer. Like I said, it's simple. It seems like we had one that was more elaborate. If somebody remembers where it is, we could use it for some kind of testing. But this is the initial part. That also is key for you to have. We also saw the validator, we saw an example, and we saw the viewer. Maybe just to finish, we were going to see the access. I don't have it here. If you wish, the last thing that I can try to do, or maybe I can upload a file through here. But in the upcoming challenges and what's coming from here onwards is how, because remember there's an issue of being able to share the margin link, how within a QR code, a safe QR code, you can share that information. That is a file that is generated where you can also see its content. with a specific key and a QR code. I will try to show you this. And it is basically where we're heading to, and that we need to start working on this and use it. An example of where is this heading to, what kind of uses it has. You can upload a QR here with the validator. That is used within this application, and once it's validated, we use a dummy key and it decodes this, and it creates a link that we can see, and where we can see the QR. This link, together with what we compared here, is precisely an IPS. And we had a link there. It's an IPS document that from the IPS, obviously, it asks us for the authorization to visualize it. But you have the key confirmed, and then maybe through the QR, you could upload and deploy an IPS document. And to finish, and obviously we will share this presentation with Carlos for you. So we saw the logical model, the standard, an example, how to validate it, how to visualize it, where we're heading to with the smart links. And this is a very interesting presentation. Dave Bronkhart in minute 820 talks about the importance of these partial links and where we're heading to in order to generate the links with the certain specific information of the IPSs, and we will do some specific tutorials with the smart hand links. And we are a little bit on time to finish, but like I said, all of the experience around the world, there's every time an increasing experience and different alternatives and ways to see what is being done as a benchmark in terms of the interoperability processes within the regions or within countries and the use of the smart hand links. We saw an open session in Brazil, and the state of Washington showed the usefulness over there, but there's also something done with the pilgrims that go to the Mecca, and they use these IPS documents. So I would just like to thank you all for your time and for having attended this session and for sharing information in the regional public goods. Thank you all. Thank you, Fernando, for your excellent presentation. And in honor of time, I don't think we have time for Q&As, but if you need extra information, please let us know. And through the Raxel channels, this presentation will be available in the YouTube channel for every one of you who wants to revisit it, or maybe if you couldn't attend. Thank you, Fernando, and we will see you, I think, in 2 more weeks. We will be sharing the link for registration and the relevant relevant topics. Thank you very much.
Gracias, hasta luego.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Nos vemos.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.